The Schmidt-Rubin was originally adopted by the Swiss in 1889. And you have to remember, this is a nation of riflemen. They took marksmanship extremely seriously. But by 1911, they knew they needed some changes.
The Schmidt-Rubin is unusual to American sensibilities. It is a straight pull bolt action, which means that instead of lifting the bolt handle, pulling it back, pushing it forward, and lowering it to eject an empty end chamber around, you just pull the bolt handle straight backward, push it forward, you have a new round in the chamber.
The Schmidt-Rubin 1911 is a modification and improvement to the original model 1889 Schmidt-Rubin rifle in 7.5 millimeter. The 1889 was very innovative when it came out for a number of reasons. First off, it was one of the first rifles with a box magazine. It was a rifle that had a straight pull action to the bolt, and it would use smokeless powder. Really up until then, the 1886 Lebel was using smokeless powder, but that was a tubular magazine in the gun, which prevented that round from being a Spitzer or pointed round due to the nature of having one stacked on top of another, in close proximity to the primer. So all kinds of folks started trying to find a way around this. John Browning with the 1895 Winchester, James Paris Lee with the Remington Lee, and with Schmidt-Rubin with the 1889 and the box magazine there.
These firearms are probably best known for the fact that they're straight pull, meaning that the shooter simply grabs a handle on the right side of the firearm, pulls it straight back, that unlocks the action, extracts and ejects a cartridge, and then by pushing straight forward, they feed in a new cartridge. It really makes for a very comfortable pull for a metallic cartridge firing repeating rifle from the end of the 19th century. And the Schmidt-Rubins stand out as an interesting moment in the development of small arms, and that's because the two men that jointly designed both the rifle action and the cartridge, they produced a firearm that through this straight pull action could fire a cartridge that used a copper-plated or a copper-jacketed bullet. This copper jacketing made it possible for bullets to reach higher and higher velocities.
The Swiss spent a bit of time in the early 20th century looking at the full-size rifle as opposed to the carbine. Military sentiment at the time was that the carbine, the shorter arm, would be much more effective for the vast majority of military uses. However, the Swiss have this deep and strong tradition of civilian marksmanship. And the marksmen, the competitors, wanted that extra accuracy advantage of the full-length rifle. And so, to a certain extent, keeping the full-length rifle in service was more a product of the desires of the competitive shooters than the actual military need.
The Model 1911 Schmidt-Rubin rifle, firing the GP11 or 7.5 by 55 millimeter cartridge, is a very successful infantry rifle and quite typical for the time period in certain respects. The rifles today are becoming quite popular. In the military surplus market, the Schmidt-Rubins are still affordably priced at a time when other military surplus firearms are not affordably priced. And so they're coming into the United States, they're affordable, they're in great condition, and most people are a bit more familiar with the more common version, the K31 carbine version that was adopted by the Swiss in 1931. Over 500,000 of those were manufactured, so that's a far more common firearm. But if you have the opportunity to look a little bit farther back in time, look back to those days before the First World War, and you have an opportunity to purchase a Model 1911 rifle, it is an excellent firearm.
Most of the Schmidt-Rubins you find today are actually K31s, but this is a rifle that you have to remember served from 1889 well into the 1950s.
It was one of the most successful straight-pull rifles ever developed. It helped Switzerland avoid battle during World War II And the gun was the Schmidt-Reuben K31.
The Swiss have had a number of very interesting military rifles throughout their history. Perhaps the one that is best remembered today and the one we're going to look at is the K31 Schmidt-Reuben carbine. The K31 is basically an evolution of the model 1889 Schmidt-Reuben. The rifle is in 7.5 by 55 Swiss, a very unique cartridge. And one of the most interesting things about this whole series of Swiss rifles is the bolt action process on this gun is a straight pull.
Most bolt action rifles, they have a locking lug on the bottom of the bolt. And as the bolt travels forward, it rises and then falls into a recess in the receiver. The K31, on the other hand, has two horizontally opposed locking lugs on the front of the bolt, and the bolt rotates in and out of battery.
Very few rifles have been very successful in the straight pull design. The American 1895 Lee rifle for the Lee Navy was one straight pull variant. Of course, the Canadian Ross rifles, 1905 and 1910, are other examples. But perhaps the best operating system on a straight pull design has been the Schmidt-Reuben that was incorporated in the K31 series.
The Schmidt-Reuben name comes from the principal designers of the 1889. Colonel Schmidt designed the gun, and Major Reuben designed the 7.5 Swiss cartridge. The Swiss military continually improved its straight pull service rifles. They started with the model 1889 and then the 1911, but the culmination of all those efforts, were put into the K31.
More on the Schmidt-Reuben K31 when we return. The K31's pinpoint accuracy and uniquely designed straight pull action served the Swiss Army for over 25 years. However, during its long service life, this Schmidt-Reuben never saw use in actual battle.
The K31 was adopted by the Swiss actually in 1932, but the model was called the 1931 model, K for carbine. It was meant to replace the K11 that was developed and adopted in 1911 that had been serving the Swiss since the First World War. The K31 was produced in massive quantities. Nearly 1 million rifles were manufactured for the Swiss government during the period of its use from 1932 all the way up until it was replaced by a semi-automatic rifle in 1958. The great thing about the K31 is the fact that the Swiss never actually had to use them in combat. The Swiss, being neutral, a country that's armed with a fantastic gun, state-of-the-art type of equipment at the time, never really had to field test any of these under extreme battle conditions.
The Swiss K31 was, of course, a very, very accurate rifle, and it was used by troops in a country that's legendary for its marksmanship. And this is a rifle that really stayed the Germans from attacking Switzerland during World War II.
Most of the early Swiss straight pull rifles were very long, almost musket length, but the K31 was a true carbine. It was only about 43 inches long, and the barrel itself was 25 inches long.
And if you remove the butt plate off the stock of these guns, many times you'll find an owner's identification tag on a slip of paper that's been held in place by one of the stock screws. And you can find out a great deal about the individual to whom that rifle was issued, his unit, and the actual years of service that person had with that particular gun. The guns are beautiful in craftsmanship and manufacture. They make a great series of guns to get into for collecting. There are a number of Swiss gun collectors groups out there. They run a price range of about $450 to $650 for specimens in great condition.
The Swiss are very serious about their marksmanship, whether it's a Schmidt-Reuben, the Stgw.57, or an export model called the AMT.
The Swiss SIG 510 is also known as the Fast 57 for both an Italian and French fusil d'assault, or the Sturmgewehr 57 in German. This rifle was developed in the 1950s, early 1950s, was based on an earlier Swiss design, and it has a roller-assisted delayed blowback action. It's an outstanding assault rifle.
The Sturmgewehr 57 was the Swiss service rifle, and then began the SIG 510 series, offered for export and commercially. The Swiss thought they could interest the Finns in their roller locking rifle, so they made some up in 7.62x39. Of course, the Finns ended up not adopting the SIG 510. But they were exported to the United States, and one more interesting version of the gun was called the AMT, and that's the American Match Target. And really, it's a beautifully made rifle. I mean, this is essentially a Swiss watch of semi-automatic rifles chambered in 7.62.
What made them attractive was that they had this iconic Swiss cocking handle, the beer keg cocking handle on it, and they had all kinds of little embellishments, like a loaded chamber indicator. A little pin would pop up on the top of the receiver when a round was in the chamber. The chambers, of course, were fluted because it was a roller-locked gun. The original Swiss versions had a hard rubber flexible buttstock, which would literally distort and compress when firing rifle grenades, because the gun was set up, it was Swiss Army doctrine to concentrate on rifle grenade use. And so the gun was capable of using the rifle grenades of that period. It came with a whole bunch of very interesting features. It had a bipod, it had a carrying handle. In military service, the commander of a unit could order his troops to partially disassemble the rifle, just swing down the trigger group, and reverse a little tab that would slide up and out, and reverse it to permit semi-auto fire only. And then when you pull it back out and reverse it back, it would fire. So you could have selective fire with it.
The rifle itself has a box magazine, has a handle at the balance point for carrying. It has an integral muzzle brake. It uses a special bayonet, and it has incredibly finely tuned sights. And these sights can also be changed if you're shooting simply for marksmanship competition.
One of the more interesting aspects about the rifle was it's roller locked, very much like the MG42. And one of the problems with roller locked mechanisms is that they wear. And as they wear, you get problems in headspace. And with the SIG, remarkably, the recesses in which the rollers pinned against were accessible, and you could exchange them. So if you had a rifle that was worn out, you could replace essentially the integral parts of the locking mechanism, and you had a new rifle.
The AMT weighed just under 8.5 pounds, and it fed from a 30-round detachable box magazine. And the 510 series, the Sturmgewehr series, also has a very clever bipod system that, when not in use, it actually folds on top of the barrel and can be easily reduced and allows a prone shooter or someone behind cover to have a very stable shooting platform.
The rifle came with something very useful for the Swiss. For the mountainous and snowy territory, it had a winter trigger. It folded up along the side of the trigger guard, and if you had gloved hands, you didn't have to remove your gloves. You just folded down this long arm, and it would operate the trigger. target shooters liked this because it allowed them with very minor motion over a long arc to really squeeze off a shot very carefully. As you might expect, the guns were extremely accurate. They had a fixed barrel. They had no gas system disturbing the vibrations of the barrel.
The rifle was imported into the U.S. very briefly as the AMT, the American Match Target version. And really, it only saw service throughout Switzerland and in South America. But it really doesn't look like your standard service rifle, and that may be one reason where it really wasn't adopted elsewhere in the world.
The big problem with the importation of the SIG AMT was cost. These are Swiss-made rifles, and they're beautifully made, and they're made of wood and steel. And it was simply the cost of the rifles that made them not terribly successful as an export military rifle, but also led to the end of importation. There simply weren't enough guys that were willing to spend that much money to buy a SIG AMT. So two things contribute to the value of the AMT now. Scarcity, there just aren't that many of them. But again, they're beautifully made rifles, and the last time I heard of one selling, it went for $6,000. Not an inexpensive rifle then, and certainly not an inexpensive rifle now. Today, people know SIG as part of SIG Sauer, but at the time of World War II and in the immediate post-war era, SIG was really the industrial manufacturer of military arms for Switzerland, and they produced the P210 pistol.
Probably the most beautifully crafted semi-automatic pistol ever produced anywhere is the SIG P210. When you see one and you handle one, you lower the slide and it actually rings.
Now, of course, the 210 is called simply the Model 49 as the Swiss Army pistol. And these guns are just simply beautifully made. The machining, the bluing, the polishing on these guns is absolutely magnificent. And it's funny to think, this is a duty pistol. This is the Swiss military pistol for most of the 20th century.
The development of the P210 started in the late 1930s. It was about ready to go into production in 1944, but with World War II winding down, Swiss interest in adopting a new military sidearm diminished. However, this gun was a very, very accurate pistol. Swiss target shooters had a great interest in it. The Danish Army showed some interest in it, and it was brought out of mothballs in 1947, and by 1949 the Swiss Army adopted it as their standard issue sidearm.
It was designed by a Swiss-French firearms designer, Charles Petter, who had earlier designed the French service pistol, the Moss Model 35.
After the war, immediately after the war, the Swiss, who had wisely sat out the hostilities, took a look at this gun. They said, you know, this Petter thing has a lot of merit. And they turned their engineers at Bern loose on this design and said, make it better. We like it, make it better. And they fiddled around for a while, understanding that the Swiss Army was ready for a new sidearm.
The major reason that it is so accurate was that Petter reversed what is the standard mounting for a slide on a frame. Whereas in, say, the 1911, the frame is inside the slide. On Petter's design for the SIG P210, it is the opposite. The slide rides in rails on the frame.
They also were sticklers because They're a nation of marksmen. They wanted the very, very best trigger they could get on a service gun. They put beautiful sights on it. They put nice hand-filling grips. They toyed with the idea of a double-column magazine, but decided that a single column was more reliable, and that's how they went.
The SIG was made in 5 variations. They still produce it as a very, very expensive target pistol. The magazines on all of the original SIGs were like the P38. They had a button in the bottom with it was spring-loaded, and you drop the magazine that way. On the new ones, unfortunately, the magazine setup is kind of like the 1911, and the magazines are not interchangeable. So if you're looking for a mag for a SIG P210, expect to pay as much money as you might pay for a firearm.
Of course, the Browning name was almost synonymous with handguns for the first part of the 20th century, but Browning never really had a good double-action pistol all its own. That's where the BDA comes in.
About 1975, an engineer in Switzerland, Edward Brodbeck, came up with a design for the economic manufacture of a new 9mm pistol. It was known in Switzerland as the P220. The Swiss government didn't want to export arms of war, so SIG went out and bought a German gun company called J.P. Sauer & Son, and the Swiss tooled it up to make these P220 style pistols.
This is a double-action pistol. It can fire with a long sweep of the trigger pull, which both cocks the hammer and releases it to fire, or it can be fired in single action. In 45 ACP, it had a 7-round, single-column detachable box magazine. And the interesting thing about the BDA is it still had the heel-mounted magazine release of the early SIG Sauer P220s. And SIG had a process for manufacturing these slides where they'd have a block, and then they'd have sheet metal sides folded over. And it was a very efficient system, and it makes for a very, very nice gun.
Swiss did succeed in selling military versions to Japan in caliber 9mm and a few other countries. But for the U.S. commercial market, they made a deal with Browning Arms Corporation to market the gun under Browning's name.
So of course, Browning is one of the most famous names in pistols. That name gets its reputation starting in 1899 with the FN 1899 pistol designed by John Moses Browning. But there have been plenty of Browning pistols not designed by John Moses Browning, and one of them is the Browning BDA. And the BDA that was imported from 1977 to 1980 is interesting in that it's a 45 ACP. That's not a caliber Browning is known for. And the guns were also offered in 9mm, about 2,700 of them, and a lesser number of 38 Supers. But the majority of the guns imported were in 45 ACP.
J.P. Sauer, who was making these guns, developed a process of polishing, of directionless polishing, of almost optical quality, to polish the sides of the slide. And if you look at one, you cannot see any polish marks. It's as though you're looking at an optical lens. And it's extremely flat. There are no rounded edges anywhere. If it has a shortcoming, it's that it and the other SIG pistols are not easily detail stripped in the slide or in the frame either. It's a bench operation to take the firing pin out of one of them. But on the other hand, they seldom need to be removed.
There was another BDA, just to confuse people. In 1977, you have the Sig Sauer produced gun, wearing the Browning name, being imported into Morgan, Utah. And then you also had a 380, it's a BDA 380. And that gun was made for Browning by Beretta. It's essentially a Beretta Model 86 that wears the Browning name.
The reliability of the gun left nothing to be desired. It was very solidly functional. The trigger pull was like a target pistol out of the box. They worked beautifully. Good endurance. It passed every endurance test that was ever subjected to. And yet, Browning, for one reason or another, never really had great commercial success with it. And they eventually just discontinued the gun, in which case it later it devolved through another importer out west, and then ultimately was brought to Interarms in Alexandria, Virginia, but not as the Browning BDA, of course, but as the SIG P220. And by then, the very expensive optical polishing of the slide had disappeared, but the underlying gun, being very superb, was something more of a success than Browning had.